the IELTS speaking test, how would you answer the following question? Can you describe the house or apartment where you live? This might seem like an easy enough question, but it can be difficult to know where to begin and what to include. So in this episode, I'm going to give you 6 suggestions for ways that you can develop your answer and achieve a higher score in the IELTS test. Hi, my name's Vic, and this is episode 3 of the IELTS with Vic podcast. If you want a free copy of the transcript, then head over to my IELTS blog, fill in the form, and I'll send it across to you by email. Right then, let's get into the topic for today's episode, which is talking about your home. The main question we're going to tackle is the question, can you describe the house or apartment where you live? Another way that this question could be asked is, what's your home like? But that question might be open to a little extra interpretation, so we'll come back to that later. An obvious way to begin an answer to the question, can you describe the house or apartment where you live, is to talk about type and size. Let's begin with apartments. The concept of an apartment is pretty much international, but it's good to clarify a few terms. If the apartment has the sleeping area and the living area all within the same room, it's known as a studio apartment. And if you're lucky, you might live in a penthouse apartment, which the Cambridge Dictionary defines as an expensive apartment or set of rooms at the top of a hotel or tall building. Let me share an interesting little cultural nugget from my own experience of growing up in England. When I was a kid in the 1980s, I never heard people around me using the word apartment. The word we used back then was flat. A flat is basically the same thing as an apartment, which can be defined as a set of rooms for living in, especially on one floor of a building. However, these days in my country, the word apartment has become much more fashionable. The word flat tends to collocate with older and less fancy buildings, perhaps those managed by the local council, also known as council flats. If a housing developer is marketing new housing, they are much more likely to use the term apartments rather than flats. Another term that feels newer to me is studio apartment, which I mentioned earlier. When I was younger, the term used in England was bedsit, which the Cambridge Dictionary defines as a rented room that has a bed, table, chairs, and somewhere to cook in it. The idea of a studio apartment has a much more upmarket feeling to it than bedsit, even though they basically refer to the same thing. When describing apartments and houses in English, we often use the number of bedrooms as an adjective, like this. A 2-bedroomed apartment. A 3-bedroomed house. So, mentioning the number of rooms is a cheeky little way that you can expand your answer. You could also mention whether you live in a low-rise or a high-rise building. Low-rise tends to only have a few floors, whereas high-rise has multiple floors. If you live in an apartment, another useful way to expand your answer in the exam would be to say which floor you live on, and perhaps which aspect of the building your apartment is located on, such as the front, back, or side. For example, I live in a 1-bedroomed apartment on the 2nd floor of a low-rise building. My apartment is on the rear aspect of the building, so it overlooks the communal garden. Moving on to words for types of house then. In England, common types of house are terraced, semi-detached, detached, and bungalow. A bungalow is a single-storey building where all of the rooms are typically on the ground floor. Some bungalows have had loft conversions to make use of the roof space, and these are known as dormer bungalows. Some older people in my country move into a bungalow in their later life so that they don't have to deal with stairs. If a house is not connected to any other building, we call this a detached house. Typically, a detached house will have garden area around it, and generally speaking, they're more expensive than other types of house, although prices do depend on which part of the country the house is in and the local area too. If a house touches one other house, typically along the side, then it's called a semi-detached house, which sometimes gets shortened informally to a semi. For clarity in the exam, I would go with the full phrase semi-detached house. The other common type of house in my country is a terraced house, which Cambridge Dictionary defines as a house that is joined to the houses on either side of it by shared walls. In certain areas of English cities, you can find whole housing estates of terraced housing, especially in cities with an industrial past, as building this type of housing was very popular during our Industrial Revolution period. Many other words for types of residential building have been adopted into English from other languages, such as villa and chalet. So it's definitely worth checking the English vocabulary for your house if it doesn't match any of those I've already covered today. Going back to the question for a moment, we were asked to describe the house or apartment we live in. We can expand our description by adding a few relevant adjectives to describe the physical space, such as small, large, spacious, cramped, modern, traditional, and old-fashioned. Here are a couple of examples. I live in a small, cramped, 2-bedroom terraced house, which is quite old-fashioned. I live in a large, spacious penthouse apartment, which is very modern and luxurious. Another option for expanding your answer is to mention whether or not you share the space with other people, as this can give context to some of the adjectives used. For example, the 2-bedroom terraced house I mentioned in the earlier example might not feel cramped if only one person is living there, but if 6 people are sharing that space, it's much more likely to feel cramped. Here are a few useful phrases for talking about living alone or with others. I live alone. I live with my parents. I live with my spouse and 2 kids. I live in a shared house with 3 other people. I've got 2 flatmates. At the beginning, I mentioned the alternative question, what's your home like? So let's return to that now. Personally, I feel like this question is open to a slightly deeper level of reflection regarding the quality of the home or the feeling of living there. I still think you could give some physical description in answering this question, but I would personally also include some kind of evaluation, such as, my apartment is pretty modern, although the walls are really thin, so it's not very private. I can always hear my neighbours arguing, so it isn't very peaceful. My house is quite stark, really. Because it's a rental, everything is painted white, so it doesn't feel very homely. We just put up some Christmas decorations though, so it has definitely made it feel more cosy. My studio apartment is really small, but the inbuilt storage solutions are really smart, so it doesn't feel crowded at all. It's painted in warm colours too, so has a pleasant and welcoming atmosphere. These are just a few ways that you can talk about the atmosphere of your home. If the sentence you need hasn't been covered today, do a little research online and let me know in the comments if you have any questions. I think it's nice to be able to give a description that is meaningful to you. To summarise, to expand your answer in the exam, you could mention the specific type of house or apartment you live in, the floor, the number of bedrooms, and whether you share the space. You can also give some adjectives to describe the physical space or even the atmosphere. Don't feel that you have to include all of these aspects in your answer though. Select the ones which feel most suited to describing your personal living situation. As I mentioned earlier, if you want the free transcript, which includes all of the key phrases from this episode, check out the link in the show notes. I'm aware that today's examples have been rooted in the assumption that a person lives in a house or an apartment, but actually a lot of people have other types of living situation that might be more temporary. I'm going to dedicate a future episode to exploring other types of living situation, so make sure that you subscribe so that you don't miss out. Now that we're coming to the end of this episode, I highly recommend taking a few minutes to create your own expanded answer to the question, can you describe the house or apartment where you live? And make sure you check online for any extra relevant vocabulary that you need. If you like, you can post your answer in the comments, and then I can give you some feedback on it, such as whether the words you've chosen collocate well. So go ahead, tell us about your home in the comments section. Thanks for joining me today, and see you next episode for more phrases and tips to level up your IELTS speaking test score and achieve your English learning goals. Thanks for listening, and have a great day.